Good morning, and welcome to the Lightcast live analysis of the JOLTS report, the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey. Today on March 31st, 2023, I'm your host, Elizabeth Crowfoot, filling in for Chris Laney, and coming to you live from Washington, D.C. Joining me are my two brilliant colleagues, senior labor economist Layla O'Kane and senior labor economist Dr. Rachel Cederberg. Layla and Rachel, thank you so much for being on today.
Good morning. Good morning to everyone. Maybe not a good morning for Jerome Powell, but
we'll get to that in a minute. But yeah, I mean, there's so much news happening right now, especially in my hometown of DC. So we are going to focus on the economic data that came out this morning. And Layla, I want to start with you. What are your first impressions of today's JOLTS release?
yeah, I mean, as I kind of alluded to, today was a surprise. Openings ticking up to 10 million. That's not something I was expecting. I think, it shows that the labor market is still very strong. Layoffs were down overall. So all of these indicators just kind of show that labor market continues to be stronger than we all expected.
Yeah, definitely surprising. And Rachel, same question to you. What really caught your attention today?
I think that headline number was the biggest shock. I think a lot of us were anticipating things holding steady, maybe even ticking down a little bit. But to see that 10 pop up this morning was a real surprise. And just to see where things were moving, we saw industries increasing their openings in April, included retail trade, transportation, and construction. So that really surprised me.
Yeah, I definitely want to dig into those industries. Layla, did you see anything interesting in terms of that detail that you wanted to bring up?
Yeah, I mean, a couple of different things, right? One is that we saw that layoffs were down in information and in professional and business services. And those are two of the sectors that sort of a lot of the tech companies live in. And that's sort of the sectors that we feel like we have been seeing at least reports of layoffs in the media pretty substantially all the way through Q1. And not seeing those layoffs show up or seeing those sort of come down in the data today was surprising to me. I think the other sector that was interesting is healthcare. So we see a lot of openings up in healthcare this month, or in the month of April. And we also see layoffs particularly down in healthcare. And so it seems like healthcare is really looking for more people, not ready to lay off people at all. But we're also seeing quits down. And so it's a little bit surprising because you would think that in a strong sector where folks know that there are a lot of openings and layoffs are low, you might see some quitting happening, some separation happening for workers because they maybe can get a better wage somewhere else or they want to switch a little bit. And so that was a little bit surprising too.
Yeah, and Rachel, you mentioned retail trade where we saw some really strong job openings as well, and layoffs were up in that sector as well. How do you make sense of that?
So I'm thinking that what's going on in that sector may be a bit of a reshuffle of what consumers are thinking about and what they're interested in, especially as we head into those summer months. But I think we've got some changing patterns of buying, and I think companies are responding to those changing purchasing patterns. And that may be some of what's going on in the retail trade. There's a little bit of movement in terms of what's going on in purchasing and therefore employment.
Yeah, Rachel, speaking of those changing consumer patterns, we also saw openings in transportation and warehousing.
Yeah.
Be really strong. Is that telling us something differently about how people are spending their money, especially coming up to the summer months?
Right. So that was a surprising one for me. We've been hearing differently from, canary in the coal mine type conversations that we've been having with clients, but it's still suggesting that these warehouses that are being built here, there, and everywhere are being used, and people are still needing things brought all over the country. And so suggests that purchasing is still going strong despite, inflation and trepidation for, the market overall with the debt ceiling talks and other issues that are very much in the news these days.
Yeah, definitely some surprising patterns. And Layla, you had mentioned layoffs and that they surprisingly fell off. It seemed before this that layoffs had started to normalize back to pre-pandemic levels. They were around 2 million in 2019, and now they've dropped back down to 1.6 million in April. What does this tell us about the health of our labor market? And should we be bracing for the shoe to drop eventually?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think it shows that the labor market is still really strong, maybe too strong. I think, low layoffs are generally always good for workers, and that's something to keep in mind. We want the labor market to cool off slightly, but we don't want workers to sort of be really harmed in the process. And I think the fact that layoffs are dropping down means that we're sort of helping that maintain. The other thing I want to say on layoffs is, this is data from April. It's pretty likely that a lot of companies took stock after Q1 of the year and said, where are we? Do we need to be cost cutting? What do we need to be doing? And so the fact that layoffs were down, I think kind of shows that maybe across the board with the economy, employers weren't thinking we really need to be doing some cost cutting measures after Q1. I know that we have been seeing some spikes again in the media of layoffs in specific sectors. It's possible, for example, that the layoff increase in retail is due to companies like maybe Amazon, who can be classified as a retail company, doing layoffs, while other sort of more traditional retailers are not, and consumer spending is sort of up on goods in that space. But I think this is good for workers for now. I'm not expecting to see a huge influx in layoffs given how high openings are across the board. And I think openings would need to come down a lot more for us to really see layoffs across the whole economy.
Mm-hmm. And Rachel, turning to you, I wanted to dig in a little bit more about the quits that we've been seeing, because it is a little bit counterintuitive seeing that openings were so strong and to see the quits come down. And usually that happens when, demand starts to soften. But could this just be that people are happy with their current jobs now after the great reshuffle, or, what else could be going on with this?
So yeah, that one surprised me as well. It could be people just finally found that right fit, right? But it also could be that, this was still in April. We were still hearing talks of layoffs all over the winter. Things were still in the news to that extent. The debt ceiling was hitting the news. People were getting a little bit more fearful of the economy. Clearly, it's still stronger than we all thought, at least from the job market point of view. But I think there might have been some nervousness, and it was, okay, let's stay with what I know. Let's stay where I am and just not rock the boat too much. So yeah, I was surprised, but I think there were, some news items that maybe influenced people's decisions at that point in time.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. There's definitely a lot with banking and then the debt
Yes.
ceiling situation. There's a lot that's racking our brains at the moment. And, speaking of some of these just mixed signals, so last April, the payroll employment gains were surprisingly strong, with employers adding over 250,000 jobs. So today's data from the JOLTS also refer to April. So given that backdrop, Layla, I wanted to get your thoughts on this. Could the rise in job openings just be reflective of that really strong hiring pattern last month? Or, is this something that we should continue to see? Or is this a trend that maybe was just a 1 month off and we could see the trend go back down later? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think they're definitely related, but usually, filling an opening takes longer than a month, right? So if we're seeing openings in April, it's not likely that those job openings were filled or hired for in April and then reflective directly in those job numbers. So I would expect on Friday for us to learn a little bit more about what jobs were filled in May, and that might help us understand these job opening numbers from JOLTS today in April. But that being said, they're definitely correlated. And I think it's a good sign in general that we have openings up, but also hiring up, which sort of indicates that we're not in as dire of a labor shortage position as we were last year, especially.
No, that's a really good point to, those connections between these two sets of data. I think it's really important to keep that in mind. Rachel, wanted to turn to you to get your thoughts on, what is Powell thinking now? Obviously Fed officials meet in a couple of weeks to determine their interest rate policy. There's been a lot of debate about whether they should pause those interest rate hikes or continue them. Do you think today's data move the needle at all? And, where's the recession signal in all of this too that's going to drive some of that decision making?
Yeah, so I think this set of data that came out this morning was not what Fed officials wanted to see, particularly that the job market is still very hot, and even speeding up. I I think the Fed will have to very strongly consider not pausing interest rate hikes and think through, that we need to keep cooling the economy off because the job market is very much not cooling. And as for that recession, I've looked both ways and I can't see it. So not around yet.
Yeah, I like that optimism. Layla, do you have anything to add, about what Fed officials may or may not be thinking?
I agree with Rachel. I also just want to add that this is just one piece of data that they'll be looking at, right? There's going to be the jobs report again on Friday. There's inflation, which is sort of what they're directly trying to cool. And so this is sort of a sideways measure of how the economy is doing relative to inflation, but it's not a direct measure. So I think they'll be considering a bunch of options, but I definitely agree with Rachel. I'm not seeing indicators of a recession in this data. And we've been told for a while it's going to happen, and I'm still waiting.
So on that point, Layla, just sticking with you briefly, what are your final takeaways of these data?
Yeah, final takeaways: layoffs are down. So the hype around layoffs in the media continues to not be borne out, not only in the whole economy, but also in professional business and information sectors, which holds a lot of those. And we're seeing some strong job openings numbers. I think this is something that we're all going to be watching out for next month.
Great. And Rachel, same question to you. Your final takeaways?
I can't wait to see what comes out on Friday with the jobs report and how that's going to dovetail with these numbers. I think there's going to be a lot of consideration of these two reports together, especially with, industries that had increases in openings, retail, trade, transportation, and construction. That's telling me that things are still really quite warm out there.
Those are some great final thoughts. Layla, Rachel, thanks so much for your insights. And to all our viewers, thank you for joining us for this conversation. Check us out again on Friday as we discuss the BLS Jobs Report live. I'm Elizabeth Crowfoot. Go to lightcast.io to learn more.